I don't know if you understood my quick intro in Portuguese.
Yeah,
I'm sure from
more
Italy,
or less.
working with different languages. More or less, right? For sure, after having traveled a lot and from plenty of places in the world, you pretty much can speak any language and understand
I wish.
anything that is related. Yeah, it's a dream come true to have you here on the show with us. Thank you very much.
No, thank you guys, because I think it's I also enjoy doing this kind of things because it's important, especially in an applied science like sports science, that we don't, as academics, researchers, don't stay within our scientific literature, but we try to connect with people like you that translate the science into messages that can be applied by the public. So thank you for inviting me.
I would like to start by a basic concept, which for you is super natural, but for most of the people who are not so used to your work, which is basically to explain what is the psychobiological model and how this interacts with the whole human performance.
Well, psychobiological model is kind of, in a way, self-explanatory. So it's a model that integrates psychology and biology, try to explain in this case, endurance performance, including cycling. But it's applicable to every kind of endurance performer, which we defined for a systematic review, anything above 75 seconds of continuous exercise. To be honest, I think it can start probably 30 seconds. When you start to pace yourself a little bit, when you don't do a true all-out effort, and there are studies showing that above 30 seconds, people pace themselves, even when instructed to do a maximal effort. So from that point of view, probably it's above 30 seconds. But if you go more traditional with the aerobic energy system, anything above 75 seconds up to multiple days, really. So it's many sports are included in this definition of endurance performance. But the difference between other, because previous models, there is one that's called complex model of cycling fatigue by Abyss, Australian colleague, is not a fusion of different models. So a lot of people have, let's say, to explain the effects of hypoxia or altitude on endurance performance, they use the kind of, let's call it oxygen delivery lactate model of endurance performance. To explain fatigue during, very intense, prolonged exercise, maybe glycogen depletion model. Another model they use to explain the effects of heat. And then when they come to the effects of motivation, for example, they use some sort of a psychological model. So for each different phenomena, they use a different model I would call it in a multidisciplinary way. Mine is not like that. It's the first level explanation. So endurance performance is the behavior, is the phenomena that I'm trying to explain. And my assumption is, because it's a behavior, a motivated voluntary behavior, it can be explained purely at a psychological level. Indeed, at the first level of explanation, I only use psychological, we call it constructs, entities or factors, components. The biology is at a lower level of explanation. So it's not the same as psychology, it's below. So first I explain it psychologically, and then we can discuss what are constructs, the main ones. And then the biology comes, where does this psychological construct come from? Because I use a same approach. So for me, what we call psychology, our mind, it's a natural phenomena that comes from brain activity. To me, psychology and physiology, they're not really separate. That's why I like the word psychobiological, because it's one word. The two things are connected because psychology is a product of brain activity, which by itself is also influenced by what's going on in the rest of the body. So, but at the very first level of explanation, I don't need any physiological constructs to explain performance. I don't need VO2 max, I don't need lactate rest, I don't need efficiency, I don't need nothing. I just need psychological variables. And then, of course, I'm interested in where these psychological variables come from physiologically so that I can influence them and improve performance.
Basically, what you say is that the brain is the main limiter of endurance performance. Everything, as you said, that is above 30 seconds.
Yes, there is the direct limitation of, it also depends how you define a limit or a determinant. We'll get there when we talk about muscle fatigue, I guess. But to me, I see endurance performance as a motivated voluntary behavior. Like any other behavior, I can explain it psychologically. psychology is the science that studies behavior, okay, and the mind, but also, behavior. So if it's a behavior, I should be able to explain it psychologically, and that's what I do. And I think I can. And therefore, of course, your performance is explained and therefore limited by your psychology. That doesn't mean that the limit is fictional or not real, because that's the problem, that you have to switch your way of seeing things. A lot of people think that psychological factors are not real. It's like because they are subjective. Okay, if I talk about lactate, if I talk about cardiac output, if I talk about mitochondria, that's something that you can measure objectively. So they think, oh, that's the scientific thing, the real thing that limits me. They see the psychology as something, in Italian we say ephemeral. I don't know in Portuguese, something not because you cannot measure it like quantitatively. It almost doesn't exist in a real sense. But it does. All we are, it's our psychology, it's our conscious experience, including the conscious experience that we have when we do like a cycling race. That's what influences our behavior. And whether you decide to attack or not, to go fast, to stop, to slow down, these are all choices that you make, which are influenced by the way you feel, the way you think, and therefore is something that I can explain using psychology. And specifically, the most important factor, the most important psychological factor is, in my opinion, is perception of effort. There are many, of course, but perception of effort is the key limiting factor from a psychological point of view.
Samuele, in this conception, psychobiological model
yes,
and physiological model are opponents or friends?
Depends how you define physiological model. If by physiological model you say that I can explain endurance performance by looking at, let's say, VO2 max, percent of VO2 max at the lactate threshold and economy or efficiency, which is the traditional way of doing it, or if you say that muscle fatigue directly limits performance, then they are opposite. If by physiological model you mean that our mind is originated by physiological activity, then we agree totally. But I think what most people mean by physiological model is by looking at models like the cardiorespiratory lactate muscle fatigue kind of model, or the glycogen depletion model, or the central fatigue associated with heat stress. That kind of, to me, so where you explain, and you see it in the figures as well when you look at the papers, you explain performance, and all the factors that you see in the diagrams are all physiological factors. I think, of course, first of all, the reason why I think those models are not correct is that they cannot explain the effects of psychological manipulations. So if I make you go last longer in an endurance test by teaching you how to properly provide motivational self-talk during the test, which is a study I did, for example, and I can prove that I increase your endurance, how can I explain that by glycogen, mitochondria, cardiac output? I cannot use those models that cannot be applied to explain why performance improves with these psychological interventions. And the physiologists say, yeah, okay, for those you use a psychological model, okay? I say, no, I can explain the effects of psychological interventions and also the effects of things like glycogen depletion, hypoxia, heat stress. I can explain them with the same model. Are you with? So you have two situations. One where you need to use two theoretical models to explain the variety of phenomena related to endurance, and a situation where you can explain with the same model all the phenomena. In philosophy of science, you should, of the two options, the best one is the one that you have only one model that can explain everything. The problem is that a lot of physiologists find it difficult to accept that you can explain the effects, for example, of physiological manipulations, that you can explain it psychologically. They have a problem with that, but I can demonstrate it to you very simply that that's the case. Because modern psychology is not about talking and questionnaires. Of course, there is that part to study consciousness, conscious thoughts and feelings. But if you go to a psychology conference, which are my favorite conference these days, there is brain scans, all sorts of physiology. It's very modern psychology is very physiological. Is a very interdisciplinary science. It's not like the way some people think. Yeah, it's very much aware that psychology comes from brain activity and it's influenced by the body. Indeed, I can explain the effects of training psychologically. For example, what is the best way to improve endurance? Is to train, right? A physiology would explain, the reason why training improves performance is because it increases VO2 max, increases the lactate stress, or increases efficiency. And for training, that would be a correct model. I can explain that psychologically, say the reason why training improves performance is because it reduces the relationship between power output and perception of effort, which is the correct way to see it. So for the same power output, I feel less effort, therefore I can keep the power output for longer. Or for the same power output, I can go at a faster, at the same perception of effort, I can go at a faster power output.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And then we say, okay,
Even,
you just explained the same thing in two different ways. Yes, I accept that the physiological explanation is also correct. However, I can explain the effects of training and the effects of motivational self-talk with the same model. The physiologist can only explain the effects of training, not the effects of, for example, motivational self-talk. So for me, the best model is the model that can explain both phenomena, not only one.
There is one thing that you wrote the opening of Matt Fitzgerald book, which we had last year in the podcast as well. I will read it out for you guys because I think it summarizes a lot of what you mean with perception of effort and how this can change the feeling in general. You write here, the pain of torture, a perception, can force soldiers to betray the country they dedicated their lives to. Further, intense hunger, also a perception, can turn civilized people into cannibals. Thoughts and feelings can also lead to the ultimate catastrophic failure of homeostasis, death by suicide, which means if you are feeling sad or whatever, you can kill yourself. We see that plenty of times. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that perception of effort and the thoughts related to it can limit endurance performance. Perceptions are powerful. That being said, is basically everything that you're trying to explain, right? The way you perceive your effort will limit your performance. If you perceive your effort as being high in the day that you are feeling that you are doing a gorgeous work, that will be your limit.
Yeah. If you perceive 450 watts, between 400 and 450 watts, which is the kind of power output that we use in MAPE sometimes to do our test. If you perceived it as easy, I'm sure you would be a better cyclist than somebody that perceives 400 watts as near maximum, don't you think? It's as simple as that. What's difficult is to explain why, all the different ways that you can reduce perception of effort related to power output. That's where things get interesting.
You got it spot on where I was going to arrive with this whole story, which was basically to connect into my next question, which is, once we understand that perception of effort is a limitation, you came with a concept which you call brain training. Let's say you can train your mind. How can we practice to feel like 400 watts or perceive 400 watts as not such a big effort?
Okay, so first of all, I have to say, can I say something and then answer to your question first? Because you mentioned the book by Matt, which is excellent, How Bad Do You Want It? Which is also, it's a great title. However, I think sometimes some people can be misleading. Because if people don't read the book, don't read.
If I may say, I like more the Spanish translation to it. I don't know how they translate it into Italian, which is "Cuánto estás dispuesto a sufrir?" How much you are willing to suffer.
Yeah.
Which is.
But then again, because effort is not necessarily suffering, and also it's not, and that assumes that the limitation of. And we did this, this is especially relevant to cycling, is that you cannot tolerate suffering anymore, which I think is BS. And I can tell you why. But the How Bad Do You Want, which is the original English title, people think, oh, it's a matter of motivation. And who is not? Everybody is equally motivated. The difference is in the perception of effort. And by the way, when I talk about perception of effort, I always talk about, because it is perception of effort, a psychophysical concept. So you have to put the perception, the psychological component, in relation to the physical component. The physical component is the power output, the speed at which you are exercising, and the perceptual component is perception of effort. So what determines who wins or not a race, primarily, is not who is more or less motivated. They're all motivated to win, if it's an important competition. What makes the difference is the relationship between perception and power output. The people have, the lowest perceptual effort for a given output. So if they're going to win, for example, I said, if you have 400 watts, it feels, let's say, relatively easy. And importantly, also, it's very not only how it feels, but also how it increases over time, because perception of effort increases over time. So, which is very important for endurance. It's not just the intensity, relative intensity, also the duration. Okay. So it's not a matter of motivation. It's perception of effort on which you have only partial control. Okay. So there are many factors that determines the relationship between perception of effort and power output. The first one, and most important, I want to say it again and again and again, is training. Physical, like traditional training. What you guys do already is the best way to reduce perception of effort in relation to workload, okay, to speed or to power output. So continue to do that. Many other factors like nutrition, for example, having a high carbohydrate diet, this kind of, have enough glycogen in the muscle is also important. Why? From my perspective, not because you run out later on of glycogen, which is actually there's an energy crisis. No, it's because, and I can explain the physiology if you want. If you cycle with low glycogen in your muscles, your perception of effort will be higher than cycling with high glycogen in your muscle. Okay, so all the things you have done traditionally based on the physiological thing, they still apply, because those things, they change the physiology, like the physiology I've studied, but they also change perception of effort. And then you will say, yeah, okay, Sam, but then you just explain in a different way what we already know. No, that's the thing. If you think the perception of effort is an epiphenomenon, it's simply a reflection of how much glycogen you have, how trained you are physically. If you think that way, then your critique will be correct. But perception of effort is not, it's very highly influenced by those factors, but it's not just those factors. And this opens up a variety of things that you can do in addition to training, in addition to standard nutrition based on physiological model. You can do other things to improve even further your perception of effort, therefore improve performance. And one of the things that you mentioned, which is the most experimental, by the way, is to increase the mental workload of the training sessions. And the way we did experimental, there was a study funded by the Ministry of Defense in the UK, was to add a mentally fatiguing task, like it was done obviously on stationary cycling, no? on sui rulli. I don't know how do you say it in Portuguese when you do stationary cycling, no? With a computer in front. Say then? How do you call it?
No holo.
Smart trainer.
Nowadays, yeah, in the home trainer. Exactly.
Yeah. And a lot of people, because it's boring, that kind of training, they actually try to use something to reduce the mental load. For example, using music or listening to a podcast like yours, or maybe do this. Now these days you can do these races, which is good if you want to do more distance. If you want to increase the physical load of the training session. However, for the same physical load of training, if you do things that reduce your mental load, you will probably have less of an effect, because we found that if you increase the mental load of a training session by adding boring and mentally fatiguing computerized tasks on the top of the already boring cycling training sui rulli, it improves.
You arrive in hell probably if you add both to a super boring to another super boring one.
You
survive it, you become stronger.
Yes, because what happens when it's basic cognitive neuroscience. Forcing yourself to do something that you don't like is much more mentally demanding than doing something that you like. Even if from a purely cognitive point of view or physical point of view, they are similarly demanding. So for example, let's say if I have to review a paper written by Asker Jukendrup, I'm going to enjoy doing that because, it's a nice paper, high quality. If I have to review a paper written by one of my first year students as an assignment, I really have to force myself because it's badly written, doesn't make sense. But mentally, it's I'm just reviewing, right? But one, I'm reviewing something that I like, and therefore it's much less effortful. In the other case, I'm reviewing something that I'm doing something I don't really like, and that's much more mentally effortful. Prolonged mental effort can also work as a training stimulus. So doing things that you don't like, it's something that is going to have a training effect on your brain. And that's why making training even more boring than what it is and even more mentally demanding than what it is can be a form of training. And I think, to be honest, physiologically, for example, very long duration sessions at low to moderate intensity, they don't really seem to make much sense, right? Because, it seems that, you need to improve your 2 marks. The best way to do it is to do quite high intensity workouts. So one would think, why do I do this I think that especially the very long sessions, they are a form of brain endurance training that people already do without knowing that they're training their brain, because you learn to stay for a long, long time and to keep doing something, even when your body tells you, okay, I'm tired, I want to go home. And you force yourself, no, keep going. I need to do another 10K or 20K, whatever. That's a form of brain training because you use a cognitive function, which is called inhibitory control, which is one of the most demanding things that your brain can do. Controlling your own behavior is one of the most difficult things that the brain does. So forcing yourself to do something that you don't like because you want to reach a goal, get better at cycling, for example, from a mental point of view is extremely demanding. And this has been studied with brain scans and everything. You really see it in a brain scan that if you do something like that, your brain kind of lights up like crazy because it involves. And interestingly, this cognitive function involves same brain areas that are associated with perception of effort. So mental effort and physical effort are very, at the brain level, they're not very different. They overlap a lot.
Overlap, and we can even see, I've discussed this in the past with doctors and we can even see them in the blood analysis. Let's say we have to say that, for example, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, it doesn't matter if it's mental stress, physical stress. We can see people who do no physical activity at all also have super high cortisol levels simply due to daily stress, mental stress.
A simple activity has video game. This is not good before a race?
That's a different thing, okay? Like it's not good to do an intense training session before a race. You do tapering, right? You don't do a super hard physical training session the day before the race, right? So the same thing you shouldn't do. Because you don't want to come to the competition with muscle fatigue. You also don't want to load yourself psychologically. But by the way, actually, that's more difficult because, to avoid physical fatigue before a race, you just you do a good tapering and you're fine. Yeah? You limit your training duration or even rest completely, 1 or 2 days before the race and you're fine if you do good nutrition. But it's much more difficult to control the mental load, the psychological load. For example, a lot of people are very anxious before a race, so they don't sleep very well. That's also, lack of sleep or poor sleep also induces mental fatigue. And also emotions, especially controlling your emotions, is very mentally fatiguing. So if you're very stressed, very anxious, but you want to hide this emotion from the people around you, like your competitors or your coach, this is very mentally fatiguing. This has been proven by a study in cyclists where controlling emotions before a time trial reduced time trial performance by something like 5%. Just controlling your emotions. And that was actually a relatively mild emotion. The emotion that they asked the people to control was disgust. So they showed a video of a woman vomiting and then eating her own vomit. So which induces an emotion called disgust, right? Even thinking about it is a bit disgusting. Watching it is even more disgusting. And then they ask a group, they didn't show any video. A group, they show the video and they say, you can express your emotion. Don't worry about it. Another group, they say, they show them the video and they told them, control your emotion. Don't show your disgust. The group that control their emotion perform much worse in a cycling time trial just by controlling the emotion of watching somebody vomit. Imagine controlling a much more intense emotion that can be a high anxiety before a race. How much that can hurt your performance, because it's a very mentally fatiguing activity for the brain to control your behavior, to control your emotions. The brain gets mentally fatigued, and we showed in several studies that mental fatigue has a very negative effect on endurance performance. So if you're mentally fatigued, you're not going to perform as well as somebody who's mentally fresh. But of course, that's when we talk about preparing for a race. In training, like you do for physical training, you want to fatigue yourself in order to adapt, right? So the brain endurance training is a way to try to increase mental fatigue during training in order to get adaptations in the brain so that when you actually do the race, you get less mentally fatiguing during the race and therefore you perform better. Because a lot of people, the way we do the studies, we pre-fatigue people mentally and we look at the effects on performance. And because of that, a lot of people think that we are talking about only the activities before a race, which are very important. So you need to control what you do before the race because you don't want to get mentally fatigued to a race. However, people don't realize that racing, doing an endurance competition, is physically fatiguing, but it's also mentally fatiguing. You need to control your tactic. You need to pay attention to your opponents, and you have to force yourself to do something which is painful. The normal, if you didn't have a goal to do well in the race, you would never, you don't do that because you like suffering so much. There might be some masochists, but the reason why you do that is because you want to win, right? And therefore you need to exert a lot of mental effort also to do an intense physical effort. So a racing in cycling and other endurance sports, it's mentally fatiguing as well as physically. So increasing mental fatigue during training can prepare you to resist better to fatigue during the race.
That comes to my point. And I think everybody who listened to us here have felt it. After you've done a race, you feel destroyed. Like if you ask you to do a simple math question, sometimes you are like bugged. I remember myself some weeks of hard training camp that simply I was so zombie and brainless that I would walk out, go to the supermarket, arrive at the cashier to pay and say, I forgot my wallet. Because I was just stupid. You do stupid mistakes because you are super tired. But the point you said is we can train not only physically, but our brain to endure and have a longer, or let's say a better coping with the fatigue. How can we do that? That's the
so
main
first
point.
of all, I think you're already doing it with training, because when you train, racing is mentally fatiguing. Also hard training and also very prolonged training is also mentally fatiguing. So when you do what you already do, guys, you train your brain as well as your muscle. I would actually suggest that especially kind of very prolonged, kind of low intensity training on the muscles and on the cardiovascular system, the effects are not that important. But you will never race only doing HIIT, right? High intensity interval training. You wouldn't be prepared to do a race. Even if from a physiological point of view, if you look at VO2 max and stuff like that, you should just do that almost. No, you also do a lot of long duration training. And I think that's in addition to, there are also some physiological effects, but I think that low to moderate intensity, long duration training, one of the values of it is training the brain to cope with the kind of physical, but also mental fatigue that develop when you stay, on your feet or on your bike for a long, long time. So I think it's a form of brain endurance training by itself. But what I call brain endurance is by doing something in addition to what you normally do, which is of cycling, in this case, was to, during the unruly training, because of course it's difficult, it's more difficult, it's more dangerous to do it on the road, because I don't want to distract you when you're cycling around by asking you a cognitive task, because then you die. And recently in Italy, we had a very tragic loss of a professional cyclist. So you need to pay attention to to the road. But you can either add cognitive load with some cognitive task. And by the way, video gaming wouldn't be good, because video gaming, if you like, it can also induce fatigue, video gaming.
Let's just understand something, Samuele, for people who understand. When you mention cognitive demanding tasks, exercises, what is that?
Well, you can do many different
examples.
I don't know. There's troop task. We use the
Sudoku or one of those apps like Lomosity.
No. It's better. No, it's better to use tasks that have two components. Tasks that require continuous attention, that you need to keep you focused on something for a long time. And the second characteristic, in addition to that, although that could be enough, in addition to that, you can also have tasks that have this inhibitory control. So, for example, one of the tasks that we do is you have to press buttons according to the meaning and or the color of the word. So, for example, if I show you the word red in red, and I tell you to answer with to press the red button when the color of the word is red. If the word is red, it's very easy to do. If I put the word green written in red, that's more difficult. But if I put the word green on the screen written in green, that's easier, because there is an interference between the meaning of the word and the color. So when the two are congruent, they match, it's easier than to do it when the two are mismatched. That's a form of this inhibitory control or response inhibition, same thing that I was talking about, which is very heavily effortful from a mental point of view, and they fire up the same areas of the brain. They fire up when you do high effort during when you're fatigued, when you do high effort during cycling. And the third characteristic, and that's why video games are not ideal. They can still fatigue you, but if you like the video game, it's going to be less mentally fatiguing than doing a boring cognitive task with just letters and crosses. And so continuous attention, response inhibition, and something that you find boring and that you don't like, those are the most mentally fatiguing things that you can do. And believe me, the tasks that we use for our experiments, they are all free. So they require continuous attention, they have response inhibition, and they are extremely boring. But because of that, you need to be highly motivated to do it, because they are boring. And you have to force yourself to do that, which is actually part of the trick.
Samuele, when you mention that, I cannot stop thinking that there is a point where our bodies cannot cope with this added mental load.
Absolutely.
Let's consider here life conditions where plenty of amateur cyclists will understand that, right, Ronaldo? Like, the guy is working 45, 50, 55 hours a day in the company, he's a doctor, whatever. Full gas. He has his personal life. He has to take care of the kids, the wife, and this and that, or vice versa, the husband. And then on top of that, he's still trying to train 20 hours as the professionals do, on top of everything. There will come a point, and I've noticed it myself, and I've done this mistake plenty of times, that when struggling to say, no, I will not do that, you just start doing things, and comes to a point that you come to the races, you are actually useless, you don't perform, because you are so mentally tired and so over things that you are going nowhere anymore.
Yeah, you're completely right. When you think in terms of load, increasing it is good. However, to the point that you recover from it and adapt to it. Because if you do too much, it's simple principle of training. But again, my perspective tells you that because mentally demanding tasks, they also add to the load. They can add in a beneficial way if you do it in a way that you recover from it, and that you get higher training stimulus. However, they can also work in a bad way. Actually, I would suggest, and again, it's not something I can prove directly with science, but I would say that probably the causes of what we call overtraining, which I think that a lot of people call it overtraining, is actually a state of chronic mental fatigue in athletes.
You call it the burnout theory, for example.
Or burnout. And that's more likely to be induced by mental, psychological load than the physical load. So you have to be very careful in taking into account the mental load, because the mental load is not only with training. The physical load is basically these days where everybody does office jobs. Most people do office jobs. So the only physical load that you have is training. Psychological load comes from a variety of activities that are not training, like you mentioned, taking care of your family, if you have a mentally demanding job, controlling your emotions, stressful period of your life. Those all add up. So you, as an athlete that also does the training load, you need to think in terms of the overall load, that is the training load plus the mental load of training, but also the mental load of things outside training, because they all, at brain level, they all accumulate. If they are too much, if you don't recover from that, then you get into a state of kind of chronic mental fatigue that is you're not going to perform well in a state of chronic mental fatigue. So you need to be realistic and take into consideration the overall load that you have when you program your physical training load.
Yeah, it's quite curious. Once you say that we, just as physical training, we gotta periodize it and know how to taper, let's say, and yes, when to add more load and when to recover. Is there any way we can measure that in the mental fatigue side, like wearables or power meters or lactate meters when we go for the physical way?
I wish. The answer is no in the way you said, but the answer is also yes if you use subjective measurements, which a lot of people don't like to use because, again, they have this wrong approach about it, and because, of course, when you ask people to rate, I don't know, how fatigued they are mentally, to rate their perception of effort, of course, you rely on their honesty. They can lie to you, and that can happen sometime with athletes. I mean, you can even lie to yourself, but if you educate well yourself and also your athletes, if you're a coach, that when you ask them to rate their fatigue, when you ask them to rate their perception of effort, which these are things that you can do. For example, I would definitely suggest, from a psychological point of view, I would definitely suggest this. At the end of a training session, in addition to your heart rate and power meter parameter, especially take a shower. After the shower, rate how hard your training intensity was on a 0 to 10 scale. It's called the session RPE scale. It's very simple. You choose a number between 0 and 10 that correspond to how hard you felt that training session was. Forget about heart rate, forget about power meter when you do the rating. Just think about how you felt during the training session. Was it hard or was it easy? And give a rating. You multiply that by the duration of the training session. You have even by itself, it's a very interesting metric, but you can also multiply by the duration of the training session, and that gives you an overall training load measure from a more psychological point of view. Also, I would also do a fatigue or a mood questionnaire, like the profile of mood state. There is a short version that takes about 5-10 minutes to do once a week. So once a week, you as an athlete or you as a coach, you ask your athlete to do a questionnaire that measure your mood. And that's a very useful approach to see whether people are getting to a state of kind of overtraining, because normally your negative mood factors, like things like fatigue, like confusion, like stress, like depression, are very low, and your and feelings of energy are very high. So you have this profile, it's called iceberg profile, where you see everything. The negative things are low, and the positive thing, which is vigor, which is very high. When you see this iceberg flattening or even getting inverse, it's called inverse iceberg. So you have very low energy and all the negative mood stuff is high, then that's the best marker of overtraining ever measured. More than testosterone, more than cortisol, more. They tried all sorts of blood tests. They couldn't find a single measure that is better than psychological measure to measure whether some people are getting overtrained. So I would definitely suggest for monitoring your training psychologically to do the session RPE at the end of each training session, and also multiply by the time, the duration, and also once a week to do a profile of mood state questionnaire, which is is a short version to monitor the psychological state of your athletes. And if you do that every week, it will give you early signs that people are not recovering for either the training load or even load from outside training. Because if you don't recover, if you don't adapt, you will never improve your performance.
Samuele, I've watched a lot of presentations from you in YouTube. Yeah. And one of them, you talked about intensity of motivation. Mm-hmm. How this influence performance, inhibitory control, perception of the effort? The motivation is important in this process in a psychobiological model?
Yes. I often talk to motivation intensity theory, which is a general theory of motivated behavior that I've applied to endurance, because it explains many things, actually. But when applied to endurance, it explains when people give up, okay? And people give up when the effort required by the task, let's say cycling, it's perceived to be either beyond what you're willing to exert, but that doesn't happen in athletes, because athletes are highly motivated. Athletes give up when they perceive their effort to be maximal, or that their effort is not enough to achieve their goal. So motivation intensity theory says that when either you reach what you perceive as your maximal effort. So for example, let's say that you do a time to exhaustion test, you will stop when you perceive your effort to be maximal. And therefore it feels like that you cannot continue. In reality, there are a lot of studies showing, including some of mine signed by other like Professor Calvet, showing that when you perceive to be at your limit, for example, a lot of you and a lot of your listeners maybe have done a VO2 max test, right? Where you do incrementally increase your exercise intensity until you cannot keep going, right? I'm sure a lot of your listeners have done this kind of test. You stop. Does it feel like you can keep going? No. You stop when you reach your maximum. You feel that you cannot keep going. Actually, I did measure after that. A lot of people thought that you stop because you are so fatigued, your muscle. Let's say that you stop at 400 watts. I don't know how good cyclists you are, guys, but let's say that you stop at 400 watts. The traditional theory is that you stop because you're so fatigued in your muscle that you cannot produce more than 400 watts, right? In reality, if I test your maximum power after the VO2 max test, you can produce maybe 750 watts. So it's not, your muscle can produce that power. That I was the first to show that. But a colleague of mine, Professor Calvet, who studied in Scandinavia, he learned to do a lot of biopsy. He did a muscle biopsy and measured how much energy was left in the muscle at exhaustion. At the point in which we call exhaustion, the point at which you stop because you cannot keep going. You give up because you reach your maximum. We call it exhaustion, okay, in physiological jargon. And they measure how much energy was left in the muscle. And he calculated for how long the athlete could have kept going at VO2 max at 400 watts. After exhaustion, the calculation based on simply on energy, he calculated that you could have kept going between 6 to 8 minutes at 400 watts after you reach exhaustion normally in the test. So from a bioenergetic point of view, there is plenty of energy in the muscle when you feel that you cannot keep going. The problem is that what's real for you is how you feel, not much ATP is in your muscle. So it doesn't really matter. But just to tell you that you always stop when your perception of effort is, if you're highly motivated, when it's maximum. Or sometimes, especially during a race, sometimes you may give up before you reach the maximum, but simply because you realize that the other guy, let's say, you're on a hill And you know that in order to win, you have to keep going up this hill for another, 4 kilometers. And then you see this guy that is, for him, is very easy to go. And you, before even starting the hill, you already feel like you are 8 on a 0 to 10 scale. You're already 8 effort. You know in advance that you will never be able to do it. So you will give up even before even trying, because from experience you can tell I'm never going to be able to do this. But your assessment of what you are able to do or not is based on your perception of effort in relation to your performance. So that's where motivation intensity theory explains in a theoretical way basically why people give up. However, as I said before, in competitive situations, is not everybody is willing to give a max effort. The key is perception to power output ratio. That's the perception of effort to power output ratio. That's the key. You need to reduce that as much as possible. So, and one way is to do the training, but there are also other ways that you can do before and during the competition. One, for example, the use of caffeine. Caffeine has been used a lot by endurance athletes with the idea that based on the energy depletion model, they say, okay, I take caffeine, I can burn more fats, that spares the glycogen, and that's why I can last longer. Now we know there have been lots of studies showing that the effects of caffeine nothing to do with that. They don't really make you spare glycogen, but what caffeine does reduces your perception of effort. That's why caffeine is very useful for endurance athletes. And you can also learn during training to use, like with a sports psychologist, to use psychological techniques. I mentioned already motivation, self-talk, also imagery, goal setting. There are techniques that you can learn, psychological skills we call them, that you can learn and apply during a race, which will help you perform better by reducing your perception of effort. So it's not just the training. You can also do psychological techniques, caffeine, other things to improve your performance psychologically by reducing perception of effort during the race. It's not just training. You can do other things on the top of that.
Voila. Well, it's a different type of training, if I may say, Samuele, from what you described. It is training, but
it is absolutely. It's training. You should treat it
from traditional physical training, as you say.
Yeah, that load you should treat it and consider it as at least as much as your physical training load, because at brain level, stress, fatigue, adaptation, all these kind of things that we always talked about in the context of physical training, at the brain level, whether it's caused by mental load or a physical load, they're very similar. There's no much difference at brain level. We classify it as different because of, cycling, it looks different than, coping with an annoying boss at work for 8 hours. At brain level, there are many similarities. And therefore, you need to consider that when you think about your overall level of stress, because you need to have stress yourself to adapt, but not too much to get chronically fatigued. Otherwise, you'll never go anywhere.